Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sake Revolution. This is America's first sake podcast, and I'm your host, John Puma from the Sake Notes, also the administrator over at the Internet Sake Discord, as well as Reddit's r/sake community. Also, that guy on the show who not a sake samurai, in case you haven't heard.
And I am your host, Timothy Sullivan. I am a sake samurai. I'm also a sake educator, as well as the founder of the Urban Sake website. And every week, John and I will be tasting and chatting about all things sake and doing our best to make it fun and easy to understand.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tim. Now, I understand that we've got another VIP today.
Yes, we have a fantastic guest.
This is nice. I like this almost like a third chair, rotating chair thing that you've got going on. This is very interesting. I like this a lot. Who's with us today, Tim?
John, not that you and I have run out of things to talk about. But
no, never.
Never. But we have a wonderful guest joining us today, an author. Today we're going to be interviewing Hannah Kirshner. Hannah grew up in the Pacific Northwest and went on to become a writer and a food stylist. But more recently, on March 23rd this year, 2021, Hannah published her first book entitled Water, Wood, and Wild Things. The book outlines a series of apprenticeships Hannah took on in the small town of Yamanaka in Ishikawa Prefecture, Japan. In addition to learning about tea ceremony, woodworking, hunting, papermaking, rice planting, and so many other things, Hannah also did an internship at Engawa, which is a local destination sake bar, and at Matsuura Shuzo, the town's only sake brewery. We are so excited to talk to Hannah today about all of this and more. So Hannah, welcome to the show. So good to have you.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah, I just finished reading your book and it is absolutely fantastic. I feel you did a really good job communicating a lot of the nuance of Japanese culture.
Yeah, and you know, so much we read about Japan is about the big cities, and I really wanted to capture the rural life and rural culture too.
Nice. That is something that I have almost no experience with. I've been to Japan plenty of times, but I always tend to gravitate towards the big city. I'm a New York guy. I like big cities. But I want to know how you got interested in Japan and sake and how do you end up living over there?
So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in a small town outside of Seattle. And there's so much influence of Japanese culture there and really many Asian cultures. There were Chinese immigrants that came in the 1800s to help build the railroads and with the timber industry. And then after the Chinese Exclusion Act, a lot of the immigrants started coming from Japan. And actually the first regular steamship route between Japan and the US was to Seattle. So in spite of all of the violence and injustices against Asians and Asian Americans in the U.S. over this past century and more, those Asian immigrant cultures have had such an influence on Seattle. And so Japanese culture in particular, I mean, even in spite of the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, there's so much influence on the food and gardens and architecture. So I really grew up around those things. And it's hard to say like when I became interested specifically in Japanese culture. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like, I don't know why I like ice cream. I just like it.
I think I know how you feel.
Even in my small town, we could get udon and yakisoba in the supermarket. Mm. But if I have to pick sort of a turning point, I would say like when I was in high school and I was thinking about going to art school, and I was spending a lot of time in Kinokuniya bookstore in Seattle and discovered my favorite contemporary artists at the time, which was Aya Takano and Yoshitomo Nara. And I decided, well, if I'm going to study art and these are my favorite contemporary painters, then I better learn Japanese and go there someday.
So you had exposure to Japanese culture early on in your life.
Yeah, definitely.
That's amazing. We read in your book about how you wound up at your first kind of internship that you did. It's an internship training at a destination sake bar called Engawa. And you met a gentleman named Shimoki-san, and he wound up being your colleague and your teacher. at this sake bar. It's such a rare experience for a person outside of Japan to have this opportunity. What was your most memorable experience from working at the sake bar? And can you tell us a little bit about your time there?
Sure. So, anybody who's interested to know the backstory can read in the prologue of Water, Wood, and Wild Things about how I ended up at Shimoki's bar, which includes living in a bike messenger house in Kyoto a decade earlier. But the opportunity to go and apprentice in this little tiny sake bar just seemed to me like it would open doors, but I didn't even really know which ones. At that point, I was already working as a food stylist and a food writer, and I wanted to write more about Japanese food and food culture. And so it just seemed like this would lead to things that would be really interesting. And it certainly did. It ended up leading to an entire book. But the bar is tiny. Usually Shimoki-san works by himself, and his enthusiasm for sake is just incredible. He's just single-mindedly passionate about sharing sake with as many people as possible and getting them excited about it too. I think the other thing that was really meaningful about that experience is that it dropped me right into a community, because a bar is also a community. So I met all these interesting people, wood turners and lacquerware craftsmen and farmers and hunters. So then when I later set out to write the book, I had all these connections, and then I sought out people to sort of represent each of the important parts of the culture of Yamanaka.
I've never been to a rural sake bar before. And also, I'm very curious about what makes this one a destination bar. I've heard that word tossed around a lot with regard to Engawa. So I'm just very, very excited and intrigued and curious about this.
Yeah, so I think one way to talk about it is the mix of guests that's there on any given night, that people do come from Tokyo or Osaka specifically to visit Shimoki-san's bar, to visit Engawa, because he has such a great collection of sake. But really, I feel like it's his personality that is the draw, and also his collection of cups. So one of the things that he loves to do is pour you the same sake in several different cups to show how much the vessel that you're drinking from changes the experience, both how the shape affects the way the aromas reach your nose, and also just the whole experience. Part of being in that bar is like you get to drink from a work of art often. He has an incredible collection of lacquerware cups from Yamanaka and antiques. So that's really part of it too. But it's not just, say, tourist spot. All these local people come there too. So while I was working in the bar, my neighbor in her 80s, this sweet, tiny woman with this bright, bright smile, would come in once a week with her money already counted out for a sake, a beer, and a whiskey. Often Shimoki-san's friends would come in after like a soccer game. You have hospitality workers from so Yamanaka, basically it's a hot spring town in the middle of the mountains, so there are not a lot of salary men here. Most people are business owners or artisans or working in hospitality, so you'd have all those people coming in too. And the craftsmen that would come in are the best in Yamanaka, so therefore some of the best in the world, and they're just there having a sake, sitting next to the little old lady and the tourist from Osaka and Shimoki's school friends.
I think there's an atmosphere in that kind of sake bar that is just magical. Really, really great.
That sounds
really
wonderful.
is, yeah.
So I'm curious, now, when you went to intern at Engawa, were you planning on writing a book about this experience, or did that idea develop over time when you discovered the different artisans working there and got to know them through your Engawa training?
It was a little bit of both. I knew I wanted to write a book, but at that point I was thinking maybe a cookbook. And so I had a couple different ideas. I mean, I had thought about writing a book that was like recipes to go with sake, or, various things I thought about. But once I was there, I realized that if I wanted to write about Japanese food, that particularly regional food, that I really needed to write about how everything gets to the table, or that was what I was curious about, was like, how was this wooden cup made? Who grew the rice and why did they grow it the way that they did? How is the sake made? Every single aspect of it. I wanted to explore the stories of how it's made and who's making it. And I could have decided to go all over Japan finding different incredible artisans feature, right?
Yeah.
But what I really wanted to do was show also how all these crafts and practices are interconnected and how they're part of a culture and a local culture and a community too.
Yeah, that was one of the great things about the book, is that, the lady who made the paper popped up when you were doing your gardening a couple chapters later. And it was wonderful to see the characters reoccurring, and it really helped you feel as a reader like you were getting to know the town as well. So I think that was a really smart choice. Yeah. And you also did throw some recipes in there as well. So you did, in essence, fulfill your cookbook wish too, right?
Yeah, there are recipes, because I think food is just so much of how I see and experience the world, and I wanted to include recipes too, which, I mean, you'll find a few of them are really very easy, and the duck and scallion skewers, or the onigiri, the rice balls, or even the karaage, the fried chicken, like anybody could find those ingredients and make those things and get to bring a little taste of Yamanaka home. But there are also some recipes that are so local that they would be very hard to make somewhere else. If you don't live near a mountain where there's wild wasabi growing along cold stream beds, that might be a little hard to make, but I feel like they still serve a purpose for storytelling. And it's the sort of same curiosity about like, how are things made that drives like the narrative of the chapters too.
Yeah, I love that.
So you got this internship at Engawa, which sounds absolutely amazing. It's now a bucket list destination for me. How did you go from this wonderful experience to the next, which is working as an intern at the local brewery?
Well, the Toji and owner, Matsuura-san, said no many times before he eventually said yes.
So persistence is what you're saying.
Persistence and patience is how a lot of this got done, and taking the time to really get to know people and give them a chance to get to know me. But even just to visit his Sakagura, his brewery, many times I was out with friends and met him, and he would say, "Oh, sure, yeah, come visit my Sakagura." And then in the clarity of the sober morning, he would text me or my friend and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, actually I can't have visitors." But eventually he invited me to harvest some of the rice. Part of the rice that he uses is actually grown by one of the guys that works in the Kura, and so I got to come help with some of the harvest. And then I got to come help with bottling, which I think might have been kind of a test, because that's sort of the most like straightforward manual labor. So I came and I did that for one day, and then he said, "Okay, why don't you come back for the first day of the season?" And I was still thinking like maybe I was just going to be there for a day. But when I showed up, he had a jacket for me with the Sakagura's logo on it and the white boots with my name on them. And so that outfit made me part of the team. And it was clear that I then worked there. And I spent the rest of that season, the entire winter, working there, basically just like a regular worker. So I got to have the whole experience of what it was like to make sake there and see the whole process. Not just see it, but take part in it.
Nice. Tim, did they give you white boots with your name on them at Hakai-san?
I did get white boots with my name on. I worked for 1 year at Hakai-san Sake Brewery in Niigata. So it was very interesting for me to read your descriptions of the sake production process. And I think you did a really good job of explaining the ins and outs of making sake, how sometimes it can be tedious and manual, and sometimes it can be really enchanting and beautiful. And I would like to know, from your experience, what was your favorite and least favorite tasks at the sake?
Okay, I'm going to answer, and then I want to know yours too. So, my favorite job was working in the mudo, the koji room. You bring the steamed rice in, and we would cover it in blankets essentially and let it slowly get to an even temperature that's cool enough, and then sprinkle the spores of Aspergillus oryzae onto this steamed, cooled rice. And it's steamed, so it's sort of like dry. It's more firm than say like a bowl of rice that you would eat. And then you knead the spores into the rice, and this is all happening in this warm room, kind of like an incubator for the koji rice. And then over the next few hours and the next few days, it transforms. It becomes fuzzy and sweet and fragrant, and the perfume just keeps changing. So it'll smell like mushrooms and chestnuts and sometimes even like citrus. And then you have this white, fuzzy mat of koji rice. And the enzymes from that are what transform the starches of rice into sugars for the yeast to ferment into sake. But just the koji by itself is it's just magical to watch that transformation. You also asked about my least favorite job. I would say bottling is probably my least favorite because it's very repetitive and not that interesting. It's more just manual labor. But so much of what we did in the Kura is actually cleaning. I feel like more than half the work is cleaning, right? Because everything needs to be immaculately clean all the time. And I actually didn't mind that because it just feels like such an important part of the work too. And there's so much about, I mean, you alluded to this, Timothy, like there's so much about being in the Kura that is just beautiful. Like, you know, you're pushing cloths in this like metal vat with a kaibo, this long pole to wash it, and there's like sun streaming in from the window coming through the steam of like steaming the rice. And so even when you're doing manual labor, there's so much about the experience that is just simply beautiful.
I gotta say, I was surprised. I had a bet in my head about what the least favorite task was going to be based on my conversations with Tim. And sadly, it was not cleaning the press.
Oh,
yeah.
Is that your least favorite?
For me, I think the koji room was really the most difficult. It was I agree with you, it was very stimulating and complex, and there was a lot to learn. But for me, it was physically the most uncomfortable because I do not like heat.
It's very hot.
Yeah, I can tolerate cold for a long period of time, but to be in that super hot environment all the time, that was really the most difficult. And working overnights too. It was the only department where we had to work overnight. So it was really the most uncomfortable for me was the koji room. But I actually really liked cleaning the press. I thought that had a beautiful aroma. Like the smell was just amazing.
You see, based on what you had told me, I thought that cleaning the press sounded like the worst thing. So even though it was your favorite thing, it was the thing that I thought would be terrible.
So what kind of press do they use? Is it a yabuta or is it something different?
Yeah, the brewery has a yabuta and they also have a fune, but I was cleaning out.
So what's the fune is, okay. Can you describe what the fune is? I've seen that, but I've never worked with one.
Sure. The fune is a rectangular box with a hole at the front bottom. And what you do is you take the mash bags and you lay them in side by side and then stack them up inside the box. And then there's a board that fits just inside the box, and using a hydraulic press, you press the board down and squeeze the bags. And all the sake comes out the hole at the bottom front. So it's a way of squeezing that is not as automated as the yabuta, the automated press.
Yeah, right.
And what did they have at your brewery?
But I guess no matter what you're doing, basically the idea is to squish the. They had a yabuta, which is more mechanized. It's sort of like a big bellows that the sake is piped through the top and then squeezed between these panels, so that the liquid pours out clear from another hose at the bottom. And then when you're done, you take apart those bellows, and in between each segment, there's like a flat sheet of sake kasu, the sediment of the rice and koji and yeast. And that part of the brewery at Matsuura Shuzo is called Hokkaido because it's the coldest part, and then the Muro is called Hawaii because it's so hot. And it really is a shock to the system going from like Hawaii to Hokkaido.
Yes.
I have a very embarrassing story that happened in Hawaii, which I will not tell you now because I will just blush too much. And it's still really embarrassing to remember, but it is in the book. It is in Water, Wood, and Wild Things. So.
You guys got to read the book if you want the good stories.
Related to being uncomfortably hot.
But I think it's not a real year living in Japan if you don't have a cripplingly embarrassing story. I think everybody goes through that. There's something that happens to everybody who lives in Japan that is just, you just can't believe it. I do have a question about the brewery president, Mr. Matsuura. One thing that really stayed with me from the chapter about working at the brewery was his descriptions of sake brewing and his analogies that you relate in the book, such as koji turning rice into fruit, or when you look at koji, consider rice to be the planet and koji can be trees on the planet. Or my favorite was that the fermentation cycle is like a party. Everyone starts out with introductions and is a little bit stiff, and then the party really gets raging, and then at the end there's maybe a few stragglers hanging around. Like, these ways of describing fermentation were so insightful, and I haven't heard other brewers necessarily talk like this. Can you tell us a little bit about...
And so poetic,
yes,
too.
Yes.
Another one is that he talks about sake being like a flower that first it's a bud, and then it blooms, and then it wilts, and how it's beautiful in each phase, and how, like, this is like about the finished sake, so how it keeps transforming over time.
Speaking of the brewery and Mr. Matsuura, we really wanted to make sure we took some time to taste some of the sake with you, and unfortunately, the Shishinosato, which is the brand name of the brewery where you worked, it's not available in the United States. Is that right?
Yeah, Matsuura-san doesn't export any of his sake at this point. It's a fairly small sakagura. They do send some bottles to Tokyo and Osaka to a couple of stores and restaurants, and it's most important to him to be able to serve the community here. The last chapter of Water, Wood, and Wild Things is about the festival, the annual fall festival, and a lot of his sake is drunk at that time. Yeah, he doesn't export at this point, but I hope that some folks, when they make it to Japan, will be able to try Shishinosato, the brand that he makes. There's also so much wonderful sake from Ishikawa. So I know that you guys got some other Ishikawa sake that you're going to taste, right?
That is right. We did. I brought the Tedorigawa Junmai Yamahai. Here in the US, we call this one the Silver Mountain. I'm a big fan of this sake, so I'm excited to be drinking it. I haven't had it in years. And Tim, what do you have today?
I also got a great Ishikawa sake. This is from a brand called Tengumai, and it's their Tokubetsu Junmai red label. So it's also a sake I'm very happy to revisit. And Hannah, what did you bring from your brewery to taste with us?
I do love both Tengumai and Tedorigawa too, but I'm especially loyal to Shishinosato, having worked there. And since I am in Yamanaka, and this is our Yamanaka sake, working in the sakagura, I was often sent home with bottles. Like any day that we do bottling, which is the sort of tedious manual labor, our reward is that we get to bring home a bottle of sake. And also Matsuura-san really likes me to taste things and tell him what I think. So he's always sending me home with things to try. And so I have many, many bottles in my house that do not have labels because when they're just, for me to bring home and drink, he doesn't always bother to put a label on it because, it's not necessary. Except for then I forget what they are. So I have 2 mystery bottles right now, which I will taste and maybe be able to guess.
Yeah. So you have a selection, and we don't know what's in the bottles, but you're going to taste it and tell us a little bit about the flavor profiles that you get from Shishinosato sake.
One of the things I love about Shishinosato is it's very, very food friendly. Yamanaka has soft water, and that is really good for making sake that goes well with food. Whereas if you have hard water, it's a little easier to make something that can really stand alone as like a sipping sake. The soft water, Matsuura-san explains, is really great for making like a table sake. That's really his goal, is to make sake that is at its best with food and makes food more delicious. And I'm going to drink it out of a cup made by Takehito Nakashima, who's the woodturner that I write about in Water, Wood, and Wild Things. He's actually the same age as Matsuura-san, the sake brewer, and has made a particular shape of sake cup to suit the local sake. So Yamanaka shiki is this lacquerware. It's a turned wooden sake cup, and the finish on Yamanaka shiki, rather than the like opaque lacquer, is often translucent so that you really see the wood grain of the material, and it's just beautiful. And Nakashima-san's cups, they're like so simple and elegant and very, very thin. Like he can actually turn wood so thin it's like an eggshell. The one that I'm drinking from is a little bit sturdier than that, but it's just exquisite. So that is definitely part of the experience too. All right, the first mystery bottle I have here, it's a green bottle. And let's see, I'm gonna pour some into the lacquerware cup.
Now, these are sakes that you've had open, right?
They've been open, so they do not taste as they would when they were freshly bottled, which may make it even harder to guess what it was.
But I think it speaks to how sturdy they are, right?
Yeah.
And that they pair well with food. They can withstand a little bit of oxygen exposure. That's really good to know as well, too.
Yeah, and I think that's like something that people don't always realize about sake. Like, whereas wine, once you open it, like even the next day, it's going to be really different. There certainly is wine that will like change and improve over a couple of days, but I feel like sake can tolerate or even sometimes benefit from being open for a lot longer than wine, depending on the style and the kind of sake.
Now, for our listeners at home, Hannah is drinking with us at 10 a.m. local time in Japan. So please be patient.
Yeah.
As it, again, it is quite early for her.
Yeah, I'm not going to drink a whole cup of sake, but I'm going to taste it and tell you guys what I taste. So I'm smelling it. It's a little floral, and like it's the part of spring here where a lot of wildflowers are blooming and the mountains are starting to be really green. And somehow this fragrance like reminds me of the fragrance of the air right now. And that's something Matsuura-san says too, that he wants his sake to be a breath of fresh mountain air for the city people that drink it in Tokyo.
Oh, wow.
Oh, I love it. He is a poet, isn't he? Like, seriously.
I think this might be the chokara because it's got a little bit of acidity, a little bit of a zip to it. So chokara means super dry. But maybe not. This feels a little bit more nuanced. And I can taste the sweetness of the koji. It's not like a sugary kind of sweetness, but it's just like, just very mild sweetness. And a little bit of umami, like, reminds me of enoki mushrooms. Yeah, this one's really bright, and it definitely makes me want to eat. It has that tartness and dryness at the end that just makes me want to eat something.
What are some of the key traits of the sake that you made there in Ishikawa? And then John and I can taste a couple other brands from Ishikawa. But I'd love to know if you had to describe the overarching flavors or impression that you get from Shishinosato sake, how would you describe it to those of us here in the States that can't get it yet?
Yeah, sure. It really is food pairing sake. Shishinosato in particular, like, it's kind of subtle. It doesn't have a really super strong character, but that sort of simplicity or understatedness is actually one of the hardest things to achieve. And I think it tends to be a little umami. Like, I personally am drawn to those more subtle umami kind of flavors as opposed to, say, like a daiginjo that's very like floral and fruity.
John and I have a lot of discussions on this show about floral and fruity, don't we, John?
That is my wheelhouse. It's Timothy's as well.
Well, thank you for that description, Hanna. With that in mind, John, why don't you crack open your sake? You have the Teidorigawa. Now, Hanna, did you venture out of Yamanaka to visit any breweries in Ishikawa outside of that town?
A little bit, and I did actually visit Teidorigawa once, but it was right in the middle of their brewing season, so I couldn't really go inside the brewery much because it's, as you know, it's very intense seasonal work. Did not want to intrude, but I certainly have had an opportunity to taste a lot of their sake at Engawa Bar.
So I have poured the Teidorigawa. It's been a very long time since I've had this one. I'm very excited to be able to taste it again. So the seimai buai on this is 60%, and the rice is Gohyaku Mangoku. Of course, this comes from Ishikawa Prefecture. The sake meter value is +6, so it's pretty dry. And the alcohol percentage is 15.8, right in that happy little normal area for alcohol percentage. I'm getting on the nose like a little bit of sweetness, almost like a honey sweetness. Yeah. Syrup? Maybe like maple syrup. The nose is nice. The nose is actually pretty nice. And this is a Yamahai, so it's not, I don't expect to get a lot on the nose. But then when I sip on it, it is almost a textbook definition of Yamahai, of like a Yamahai Junmai. If I were to like look up Yamahai Junmai in a dictionary, this is what I would expect to see. It's got all of those flavors, that kind of, barely present sweetness of a strong core centerpiece that like really wants food. And then it's a little bit dry on the finish. This is an eating sake, not a sipping sake, I want to say. Although this brewery does make wonderful sipping sakes. This one I think is a little bit more of an accompaniment to a more of a hearty meal. Tim, how's your Tengumai?
This is their Tokubetsu Junmai, and the brewery name is Matsuura Shuzo. And as all these sakes are, they're all from Ishikawa today. This has 16% alcohol, and it's also 60%, and it's also Gohyaku Mangoku, just like John. Mm-hmm. And in addition, it's also SMV +6. So there's a lot of similarities between our sake, but mine is not Yamahai. Mm-hmm. It's just a regular Tokubetsu Junmai. And when I taste it, it's got a little bit of an earthy note to it. And normally Gohyaku Mangoku is a little bit quieter and airier, mm-hmm. but this has a little bit of richness to it and nice rice flavor. Very silky on the palate. The texture is really wonderful. And just like all the sakes we talked about today, I'd love to pair this with some food. It's begging out for, mm-hmm. Some yakitori or ramen or something yummy. And it would just, I think, pair beautifully with something like that. So really enjoyable. And it's interesting that both of these that we picked, John, are both using Gohyaku Mangoku.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this has so much like umami going on that it almost makes me feel bad. Like I feel like I'm not doing. I feel awful not having this with food. I'm like doing it a disservice by just sipping on it because there's so much more. It's like no.
My mouth is still tingling from the last sip. Like I really want some like grilled fish with a nice little soy sauce glaze on it, or something kind of fatty would be nice. But I'm curious, when you guys taste, you talk about the polish percentage and the alcohol percentage and all these things. Like, how much do you feel that actually tells you about how a sake is going to taste?
I love that question. And I think that Tim and I might have slightly different answers to this. Mm-hmm. So, Tim, I want you to go first.
I also love that question. I've been studying sake for 15 years, and when I first started, having these stats and rice milling numbers and rice strains, I viewed them like a handle to hold on to, something to get a handle on the sake. And I don't think they should be the end-all, be-all of how the sake should taste, or you have to live and die by these statistics and numbers related to the sake. But for people who are just getting into sake, I find that they offer a really great way to take a safe step to understanding, and I use them as a way to help people get a handle on what a sake could be all about. So that's my answer to that.
Well, as a sake educator, I think that's a perfect answer for you. And I would have expected nothing less than a perfect answer. However, for me, yeah, it is, as somebody who's mostly drinking sake for myself, unless I'm picking out sake for the show, I don't focus on it that much. I like to know it because it's something that I used to look at when I was new at drinking sake. It was something that it was my handle to hold on to, as Tim described. But these days, it doesn't really have the impact on flavor that I thought it would when I was first getting into this.
Yeah, I feel like the differences among sake can be so subtle, and so much has to do with like how it's made, and also the water, and then the process of the sakagura that and maybe this is just me as like more of like a writer and a drinker, and not an expert in sake in sort of like a technical sense. Like, I don't find those things very interesting or useful. I mean, interesting in the sense of like, yes, I'm always interested in like how is something made, right? That curiosity really drives me. But as choosing what to drink, I don't know. To me, the best way is just tasting things and finding out what it tastes like, and then just trusting my palate.
I think if there's a thing that I look for, it might be the overall classification. And that's just because a lot of the times producers will, regardless of polish percentage and all this other, all the other stats, will sometimes, when they're trying to make a ginjo, they're going to go for a particular style with that. And so I might gravitate towards that because I like that style.
Yeah,
it's
that
less
makes a lot of
about,
sense
oh,
to me.
I it's just rice milling or bust.
Yeah.
Well, Hannah, we want to thank you so much for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and congratulations on your book. It's really fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you for reading it, and thanks for chatting today. This is really fun.
So where can our fans on the internet find you?
Oh, okay. I am on Twitter and Instagram as @Sweets and Bitters. Sweets, the letter N, bitters. And my website is just hannahkirshner.com. And you can find updates there on the book, on Water, Wood, and Wild Things, and events related to the book, where to buy it, all that.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And we also want to thank our listeners for tuning in as well. We really do hope that you're enjoying our show. One way that you can really show your support for Sake Revolution would be to get on Apple Podcasts and leave us a written review. It's a great way for us to get the word out about our show.
And after you're done leaving your review at Apple Podcasts, please go and tell a friend, someone that you trust with very good podcasting, and get them to subscribe. And then while you're at it, you should subscribe. And then every week when we put up a new one of these episodes, it'll show up magically on your device of choice. And you guys know how this ends. You won't miss a single episode.
And as always, to learn more about any of the topics or sakes we talked about in today's episode, and to get links to Hannah's amazing book, be sure to visit our website, sakerevolution.com, and check out the detailed show notes.
And if you have a sake question that you need answered, we want to hear from you. Reach out to us. The email address, as always, is feedback@sakerevolution.com. So, until next time, please remember to keep drinking sake and
Kanpai.
Kanpai.